This is a quick summary of what data types are in Java and how you can create variables and use them in Java. This is aimed at people who have little to no programming experience prior to this, but it's expected that you understand that when you write a program, it runs one line at a time in sequence. So I hope you know the basics. So if you search for Java primitive data types, which is one of the things that you might come across when you're searching for data types, you will see there's 8 primitive types built into Java. Byte, short, int, and long, they are integer type data types. In other words, you can store whole numbers, and they can be negative numbers, they can be positive numbers. And if you actually read the details, you can see what the ranges are. And then you get the float and the double types. They are for numbers with decimal points, or in other words, floating point numbers. So there's also Boolean and Char, and that's as far as what they will list as the basic or the primitive data types are for Java. But there is also string, which is for text or just plain text messages. So it's not a single character, which is char. It's for a string of characters. And here's an example. So if you put it inside double quotation marks, it means it's text. So we can't avoid that because we often need to display text messages in our programs. Alright, so let's very quickly look at a program. Now here I have created a new project called variable demo because I'm going to demonstrate variables. Then to that one I added a new class through this, and then when I created the class I gave it a name called demo of variables, just to keep that name different to the project name. It's not an issue to have the same name, I just wanted to show that it can be a different name. Alright, so one of the simplest Java programs that you might come across is the Hello World program. Now let's try to write this slightly differently. Okay, so we'll say system.out.print. I want to say hello, and then I want to print a space, and then I want to say system.out.print not world, but I want to mention a name. So let's pick a name, let's say Alex, and if I run this, it'll say hello Alex. Now it would be so much nicer if this program were to be more flexible, so it doesn't always say Alex. It can, if it can take the user's name as an input and display that, it'll be so much more interesting. So what we can do here is, because this hello part is fixed and the space is going to be there between the two words, we can just replace this Alex. Now to do that, I will put that into what we call a variable as the first thing. Now a variable is like a container. If you are going to use a container for something, or if you're going to get a container for something, you need to say, or you need to be mindful about what you're going to put in the container, right? So, and also another thing you do is you give the container a name. Now we often come across the analogy of a program being like a recipe for food. So if you're going to bake a cake, you might say that, okay, you need sugar. So sugar is the type of the ingredient or the thing that you want, and you will put sugar into a container, and you will call that the sugar container for the batter. All right, and then you will say how much or what the sugar amount is. You might also have a separate container for sugar for the icing. right? Because you want to keep those two quantities separate because they are used for two different things, although they are both containing sugar, right? So we will create different containers. Some of them might have the same types of stuff, but they are used for different purposes. So Alex is a string, in other words, a text message. So it's actually one of the most common types of things. So we will start off by creating a container or a variable. All right. So it's a variable contains something we want. So we will say it's going to hold a string, and we need to give this thing a name. So this is just like saying this is the sugar for the batter. We want to keep it separate from other strings, so we need to give it a name. So a name for this one would be first name, because we are creating this variable to hold the first name. So we call this the declaration. By putting these double slashes, what I have done is I've said this is just a comment for my reference. It doesn't really mean it's not a statement, it's just text. So the declaration part. All right, so we have created a string called first name, and you can see that already Eclipse is saying, okay, there's some issue with this, and it's saying that the variable is not used. So if you now replace this Alex with first name, there's going to be a problem. The problem is, yes, we have asked for the container, we have given it a name, we know what exactly we are going to store in it, and here we are trying to display the contents of the container, but we haven't put anything into it. So we have to say first name equals Alex. Now what we have done here is assign the value from the right side to the left side. So basically I'm running out of space here, but a more descriptive way to say is to take whatever that's on the right side of the equal sign and put it on the container, or put it into the container or the variable on the left hand side. Now at this point I want to point out that you can't do it this way, because can't do this because you can't put a container into a value. Okay, so can't put a container into a value. That doesn't make sense even when you say it out. All right, so it's always going from the right side to the left side when you have a single equals sign in programming, in most programming languages. All right, so let's get this program to run. Now if I run this, it'll produce the exact same output, which is good for now, which is a step in the right direction. Now I want to make this a bit more flexible. I want the name to come from the user. All right, so it's like a greeting message, and I want it to be a custom greeting. So one of the easiest ways to get some input in Java is to use the Java Swing package. And now instead of saying the first name is Alex, what I will do is, now I can leave that there, but I can also I will comment it out because I don't want to use that. I will say first name equals J option pane, so to get an input, so show input dialog, and then I will show the message enter name. All right, so this is one of the easiest ways to get some input, and it's also nice because it's it shows up as a little window, a dialog box rather. So once we do that, what we have done here is, now if you look at what we did originally, we said first name equals Alex. In other words, whatever the Alex part inside the double quotation marks, it was assigned to first name, right? So it's the same thing that's happening here, except we have put a special command saying J option pane dot show input dialog, and we've said enter name. And what that does is it so it'll ask the user to enter I will actually show you. It's much easier to see it work. Alright, so it'll show up a nice window like this, and now I can put any name I want, but I'll try to replicate the same output. So I will enter the same name, Alex, and if I hit OK now, it'll show the message as it did before, but now this will work with any name. So what happens here is, so I'm running out of names. What happens here is very similar to what the previous one did when we assigned the value directly, or when we hard coded the value. So it after it takes the input, whatever the name that was entered, now the last name that I entered was Atom. So if I entered that, what happens is effectively it does something like this. It replaces that code or that expression with the value that the user entered. So that's what gets into the variable or the container called first name. But of course that depends on, so what I have highlighted is the thing that's going to get replaced, and that depends entirely on what the user enters at the time you run the program. So if I run it now again, so it'll say enter name. I can enter any other name, Abba. So I'm sticking to names starting with A and saying hello Abba, and like that. Alright, so that's a demonstration of how strings work. Now if you have a look at this, you can see that there are 8 other types of data. These are actually the proper types of data that's built into Java. A string is not exactly what they call a primitive data type, but it's also supported by Java. So byte, short, int, and long are integer number types. In other words, they are whole numbers. The differences are in the range of values they can store. So the byte is basically 1 byte of information. So the amount you can store, or the value that you can store in it, is pretty small. So the range is between -128 to 127. I'm not going to go into the details of how how we determine that or how we calculate that, but it can be calculated based on the size that's allocated. So a short is a type of an integer as well, and it's 2 bytes, or in other words 16 bits, and it has a slightly bigger range. And int is the typical one that we use, and that has a much bigger range. And long means an even bigger range of values. We can have very large numbers that are whole numbers. So float and double are what we call floating point numbers. So floating point numbers are numbers with decimal points. So just like with int versus long, float versus double is just like that. Double has double the amount of space that a float has, so you can have much more information in there. Then there's also Boolean, which is for true or false, or true or false values. You can have only true or false, not both, of course. And there's char, to mean that it's a single digit or a single character. Okay, so sometimes we think of these as ASCII, but technically it's Unicode, but ASCII is a part of Unicode as well. So unless you're going into additional stuff, you can think of it as the ASCII codes. So if you search for ASCII codes, you can actually see what characters are, and what characters are there, and what their corresponding numerical values are, and so on. So anyway, so the way a variable is created is like this. It doesn't matter what type of data it is. You need to declare it. So the declaration part is the place where we mention the data type. Okay, so declaration, only time we mention the type, right? So you'll see that when I used first name to print it, or when I used first name to put a value into it, I never said anything about a string. So I didn't use the word string anytime after declaring the variable or creating the variable. So keep that in mind, because a lot of people think, okay, every time I use the name or use the variable, I need to say string or whatever. And if you do that, it's like you're trying to declare it one more time, and then the language will say you're trying to duplicate this thing. So you should not. So don't put string after the first time. After the first time, after you create it, you can use it any number of times. So what happens if you have two things putting a value into the same variable? Is basically it's the same container. The most recent value, or the value that you put now, will overwrite the value that was there before. So if I have Alex here as the first value that I assign, and then I put Abba again, it'll only show the most recent value. It's sort of like an assignment submission. Only the most recent submission is used. Of course, now after printing it, I can change, I can put another value into it. So just like what I did before, and I can say, I can put a name. So now I will put atom, ATOM, and then I can print it again. So it'll first print the value that I entered through the input window, input dialog, and then it will print the value I manually assigned. So this is the second print statement. That's where the second output will come from. So when I run it, so I can enter a name, ABBA, and if I hit enter, it'll say hello space ABBA, and then it's going to change the contents of the variable to atom, but it's not going to change the first output. Also, because of the way I have written it, it's going to print ABBA and atom side by side. So we can fix that problem just by saying print ln. So if we say print ln here, it'll put a new line immediately after that, and it's just like hitting enter in a text editor. Alright, so let's try to replicate that. So ABBA, ABBA, hello ABBA, and then atom is printed from this line. So just because you overwrite a value in a variable, it doesn't alter what you have done with it. So everything is a state-based thing. So at this state, the value Alex is assigned. At this state, the value that's coming from the keyboard or the input dialog is assigned. And then here this will print hello, and once it does that, it's gone. It's just you can't change it. So it basically shows the current state, sort of like the way a typewriter works, because in a typewriter, when you type things, you can't erase them. It doesn't go back and change anything. You have to do that sort of stuff manually. So this is a demonstration of how strings work. As I said, if you want to create something a bit different, if you want to create an integer, it's again not too different. You just mention the data type, and I'm going to call this my first value, which is an integer, right? And I can say my first val. I have to put a number into it. I'm going to put number 7 just because I couldn't think of any other number. And I can say system.out.print ln, or print value 1 is, or first value is, and I can say system.out.print ln my first val. Now some of you who already know how these things work will wonder why I'm putting things on separate lines. Now, if you are at that stage, you probably shouldn't be looking at this sort of a demonstration because you would already know how variables work. But I just wanted to write it like this so that I keep things separate. So if I run this, it'll say first value is 7, and I can also create another variable called my second val, and I will put a value into it, and then that will be 10. So I can similarly print second value is my second value. Alright, so when I print this, it'll print the two things on two separate lines, and I can now create an answer. I can say I want to divide 7 by 10. So I can say double. I said double is the common type of number with a decimal point that we want. So if I say double answer, and then I want to put a value into that, I can say the answer is my first val divided by my second val. Now the problem here is when it does the calculation, it's not going to first divided by second is, alright. So the problem here is it's not going to show the correct answer. There is a interesting reason behind that, and so I'm just going to put a print ln here, but it doesn't make a difference. So this is going to it should give me 7 divided by 10 is 0.7, because that's what maths tells us, but this is going to give us 0.0. And the reason for that is, as I said, it does whatever that's on the right hand side, and then later it puts the value into the left hand side. Because the stuff on the right hand side are all whole numbers, it actually does the calculation in terms of whole numbers. So you might be thinking, okay, if it's a whole number, 0.7 should be rounded up to 0.1. But it's not really like that. With integers, what happens is everything after the decimal point gets discarded. So even if it's 0.99999, like a whole bunch of nines, it's still going to get rid of everything after the decimal point and round it to 1, not 2. So that's the normal behavior. In fact, it actually comes in handy quite a lot of times, believe it or not. So if you want the answer to come as 0.7 in this instance, we need to change one of these things to a double. So now when I do this, it's not an issue because I am putting an integer into a double, and it'll automatically take it as 10.0. But essentially what we are doing is we are assigning 10.0 to the second value. So if you have some unexpected outcome like that, that's probably because you are dealing with only integers. Remember to convert something on this right hand side, especially if you're using division, make sure one of those things are a double or a float at least. So just to very quickly recap on the idea of how variables work, you mention the data type and the name of the container, right, or the variable. We have different names for things, even though you can have multiple containers of the same type. So it's not enough to just mention the type. When you say the data type and the name, and then after that you can put a value into that container. So you have to put a value into it before you actually use it, because as I showed earlier, it's going to complain if it's not initialized with a value at the time of say displaying the contents. So when you're assigning a value, you put the variable name and then say equals and the value on the right hand side. That value will be, or that whatever that you put on the right hand side, whether it's a value or even if it's a calculation like this, which is what you do with numbers, that will get assigned to the left hand side. And after that you can display it or do anything you like with it. So that's some of the basics of how variables work. There's a lot more to it, and it's best to see these things in worked examples so that you can understand why we do certain things. All right, so that's it for this video.